Dragon Ball has a long history of critically acclaimed video games, from all-time classics like the Budokai Tenkaichi series to newer releases like Dragon Ball FighterZ. But they can't all be winners, as Dragon Ball has had its fair share of duds. Today, I scoured the internet in search of the worst Dragon Ball games out there, and I came across 3 usual suspects: Dragon Ball Z Taiketsu, Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 22, and Dragon Ball Evolution. So let's take a deeper dive into each of these 3 games to find out if they truly deserve the title of the worst Dragon Ball games of all time. Imagine for a second, if you will, Dragon Ball FighterZ on a handheld console. Ignore the Nintendo Switch. Imagine it on a dedicated handheld such as the Game Boy Advance. Well, it's nothing like Dragon Ball Z Taiketsu because Taiketsu kinda f***ing sucks. Dragon Ball Z Taiketsu is a fighting game that was released exclusively on the Game Boy Advance on November 24th, 2003. It was published by Atari and developed by Webfoot Technologies, the developers behind hit titles like The Biggest Loser for Nintendo DS and Mahjong Ancient China Adventure. Oh, and the Legacy of Goku series. So they do kinda know how to make a competent Dragon Ball game. However, unlike the Legacy of Goku games, which are RPGs, Taiketsu is a 2D fighting game, a particularly bad one at that. Its core gameplay is atrocious, and its lack of content doesn't help things either. Now, it might be easy to try and blame the lackluster gameplay on the fact that this is a Game Boy Advance game, so of course it's not going to be a stellar fighting game, but you can't really say that when all of these exist. Taiketsu received a very poor reception, receiving a 40 critic score and a 4.7 user score on Metacritic, but somehow it sold decently well, selling 620,000 copies and making $14 million in the US by August 2006, as well as being the 45th highest selling handheld game between January 2000 and August 2006 in the US. Taiketsu is most similar to fighting games like Mortal Kombat, with its realistic sprites and 2D gameplay. The gameplay itself is quite simple, with all the basics you'd expect from a 2D fighting game, such as light and heavy punches and kicks, directional attacks, and specials. In terms of Dragon Ball specific mechanics, you can charge Ki, which is required for special attacks, and enter sky battles, which means both characters fight in the sky. The problem with this gameplay is that it just controls and plays terribly. It's difficult to pull off specials as inputs just don't work half the time. Speaking of not working, sometimes your attacks just won't land at all. And if you ever do get the chance to pull off a special attack, then it is completely unavoidable and unblockable. And when your moves do work, the combat is so weak that it's able to beat arcade mode by essentially just trapping the enemy in a corner and spamming one attack the entire time. A disappointing part of this game is that there are no transformations. Some characters will temporarily transform as part of their special attacks, but will revert to their base form once it's done. This is even weirder for characters like Frieza and Cell, who are only playable in their first forms, even though their roster portraits are of their final forms. Let's move on to the characters, of which there are 15 in total, 7 in the base roster, and 8 unlockable characters. Like I mentioned before, the sprite designs are reminiscent of Mortal Kombat's. And it's not in a cool, wow, I can't believe they use actual photos for their sprites, these look so realistic way. It's in a, wow, this kinda looks like way. They're lacking any amount of detail, which wouldn't have been a problem if they just went for a more cartoony style instead of this weird pseudo-realistic style. The animations are also terrible, being incredibly flat and lifeless. All of them have the same basic moves, but do have variations in their specials as expected. But how do we unlock them, you may say? Well, let's move on to game modes, of which there aren't many. There's a multiplayer mode using the GBA's link cable, but of course I didn't play as anyone because who else would want to play it? In terms of single player offerings, there's Tournament, which is essentially just arcade mode, and it is the path to unlocking new characters. There's Endurance, which just sees how many opponents you can beat in a row with one single health bar. Time Challenge is just Tournament, but the matches are quicker, and Sparring is just practice mode. And that's Dragon Ball Taiketsu. It looks horrible, it plays horribly. I mean, there is a shop where you can unlock images and music and other junk, but that's about it. The art style was a very strange choice. It just makes the game look really laughable. And the gameplay is so unpolished that it doesn't even work half the time. It definitely is a contender for the worst Dragon Ball game. Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 22 is the 22nd game in the Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle series. Okay, not really, but the naming scheme is very weird. The 22 comes from the number of playable characters, which is in fact 22. Kind of. This would be like if Super Smash Bros. Ultimate was called Super Smash Bros. 89. But what's even funnier is that there are really 27 characters in total because there are 5 unlockable characters. And the funniest part of all this is that once you unlock all of the characters, the title screen literally changes to Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 27. Absolute cinema. Ultimate Battle 22 released exclusively on the PlayStation in Japan on July 28, 1995, and in North America a whole whopping 8 years later on March 25, 2003. The wait clearly was not worth it, as it was widely criticized by critics and players alike. It currently sits at a 25 critic score and a 5 user score on Metacritic. I think the funniest part about this game's North American launch is that it released in North America after the PS2 had already launched and had titles like Tekken 4. You tell me which fighting game looks better. Ultimate Battle 22 is yet another 2D fighting game, but it does feature 3D stages. That's probably the first thing you notice about this game. The sprites are 2D, and yet the environment is 3D. It's incredibly jarring, especially when the stage starts to spin around, and the sprites look really weird, feeling completely out of place. That's a shame because the art style was a pretty good idea. Essentially, the characters look like they are quite literally just ripped out of the anime and put into the game. I think with the proper stages, this would have been a really neat look, but they had to ruin it with these pointless spinning 3D environments. Well, I can't really blame it all on the stages, because despite the novel concept, the character animations just aren't the best, or even good for that matter. Just like our good friend Taiketsu, the animation is clunky and outdated. The gameplay doesn't fare any better. The combat is quite simple, but runs into many of these same problems as Taiketsu. Attacks sometimes don't land, inputs are hard to perform, and it's overall very stiff. Despite making fun of the naming scheme, the character roster probably is the best part of this game. The character select screen does suck, because it just looks like a mess of pixels and it's hard to navigate, but a total of 27 characters is a pretty good amount. The main game mode here is again another arcade mode alongside an actual tournament mode and build-up mode, which is kind of a weird addition. In build-up mode, you can level up your characters by playing matches as them. This game mode is also how you unlock new characters, but the weird part about this game mode is that you can supposedly save your character to a memory card and then use that character on another copy of the game to battle your friends and such. Kind of a pointless addition if you ask me, but Ultimate Battle 22, you do you. Overall, Ultimate Battle 22 does suck. It had an interesting art style, but coupled with the 3D animation and the low quality animations, it just doesn't look good. The gameplay on top of that isn't great either. I think they knew the only thing going for this game was its roster, which is why they named it Ultimate Battle 22, and not because there were 21 previous Ultimate Battle games. Dragon Ball Evolution, despite being based off of the worst piece of Dragon Ball media ever, the live-action movie, might actually be the best game on this list. Alright, put down the pitchforks, hear me out. It's because it's basically just a reskin version of an actual good Dragon Ball game. Dragon Ball Z Shin Budokai Another Road is the sequel to Dragon Ball Z Shin Budokai. Both these games are PSP exclusive fighting games, just like Dragon Ball Evolution. Just like is meant literally, because Dragon Ball Evolution just reuses the same game engine as Shin Budokai Another Road. It seems like that reused engine wasn't a very popular decision. Evolution received generally unfavorable reviews, even being cited by Games Radar as one of the worst games of all time. For this video, I've been mainly going off of Metacritic scores. The scores for Dragon Ball Evolution, the game specifically, are 28 for critics and 1.3 for users. But I believe that the vast majority of users who reviewed this actually just thought that they were reviewing the movie. I mean, just read these reviews. They're literally just talking about the movie itself. Let's get into the actual game. Like I mentioned before, the gameplay is literally just Dragon Ball Z Shin Budokai Another Road. It's nothing too complex, but it runs well and feels good to handle, unlike our previous two games. The gameplay being solid is about as far as the positives go. The rest of the game is chock full of negatives that at that point you might as well just play Shin Budokai instead. The elephant in the room is that this is based off of the movie, which is obviously terrible, so the character designs and story mode are equally terrible. It's not bad enough that the characters are modeled after the movie's designs, but they're also modeled poorly. Those PSP graphics just aren't doing them any favors. And the story mode is both poorly written and poorly formatted. Poorly written because it's based off the movie, so the story has essentially nothing to do with actual Dragon Ball, and poorly formatted because it's presented through either PNGs and text boxes, or through cutscenes that are at least pretty funny to watch. Aside from the story mode, there's arcade mode, online, training, and mission, all of which are pretty self-explanatory. Despite the gameplay being solid, there is literally no reason to play this over Shin Budokai. I mean, you will get some entertainment out of the terrible cutscenes, but you can get the same exact reaction out of just watching a long play on YouTube. Seeing as Dragon Ball is one of the biggest anime properties in the world, it's no surprise that it has its fair share of crappy video games. There are even more out there that I didn't get the chance to try, but out of these three that I did play, I can confidently say that they're some of the worst, with no real incentive to try out any of them. Unless, of course, you're making a YouTube video about the worst Dragon Ball games of all time.